It's The Dana Show.
We're waiting for some investigations and waiting for the results, and we'll have them very soon, and I think we'll be making a statement, a very strong statement, but we're waiting for the results of about 3 different investigations, and we should be able to get to the bottom fairly soon, and I'll see you on the plane.
Mr. President, what are you considering for possible consequences for Saudi based on those?
Well, it'll have to be very severe. I mean, it's bad stuff, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it is. It's bad stuff. But whenever you ask questions about it, the media immediately assumes that you're somehow participating in a whisper campaign to save Trump and discredit this individual. But there's more to it than just that. Joining us right now, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who this is his wheelhouse, of course, who knows all about this, just to give us some perspective on this. And Dr. Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and he's also the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. And you can go to takebackislam.com, where he's also the founder. Dr. Jasser, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Give us some perspective on this, because, I find it hard to believe that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia would decide to, because he had hurt feelings over something that this Jamal Khashoggi wrote about in his columns, that he would carry out an assassination in broad daylight, where his people in his inner circle would be caught on closed-circuit television entering the consulate. And just over the column, I mean, there seems to be a lot more here. Is that an accurate way to kind of view the situation?
Well, there's certainly a lot more there, and it is just baffling to me to see the gyrations that the left media, the legacy media, is doing in this story, which is all of a sudden they've taken a guy who, under any other planet would be, I'm surprised he even had a resident visa here, and now the Washington Post is lionizing him and making him into a hero, and they haven't really looked at his writings, and we'll get to that in a second. But as far as the Saudis are concerned, they're a tyranny. They're a Middle East dictatorship, and yet President Trump was left with a Obama disaster that had been so one-sided to the Iranians that he's trying to resurrect sort of the 20th century model of foreign policy, which was a balance between Sunni and Shia. So at the end of the day, us becoming unhinged about what happened to Mr. Khashoggi is going to end up benefiting the Iranians, the Qataris, and the Turks. Now, that doesn't mean that an ally has free will to assassinate columnists and activists, but we should not be glassy-eyed on exactly what this guy was all about. And what was he about? Well, I'll remind you, 3-4 months ago, the Saudis put into sort of a detention in the Ritz-Carlton all of the royal family that was involved with the Muslim Brotherhood. So they took basically $1 trillion that had been used globally for the last 50 years, where the Saudis had been funding Muslim Brotherhood operations around the planet. The last 6 months, they put a stop to that. And part of the lead of that was Talal bin Walid, who owns a center at Georgetown, has owned a center at Harvard, etc., which has been radicalizing Muslims in the West. Well, one of the close friends of Walid is Khashoggi. So Khashoggi came to America a year ago. There's no doubt that the prince's folks wanted to bring Khashoggi in for interrogation and other things. So odds are that went sour. Odds are, like many other dictatorships, my family knows the Syrian one pretty well, they're pretty ruthless thugs, and they may have just gone south. But the bottom line is this guy was part of the royal family that was pro-Islamist, pro-Muslim Brotherhood, anti-American, very anti-Israel. The Saudis shifted that in the last 6 months, decided to become more pro-Israel. This isn't real reforms, it's more pragmatic politics, and this guy was standing in the way of that with a Twitter following of 2-3 million, was starting to write more and more critical against the Saudis, and they probably wanted to contain him.
Well, that would make sense. The New York Times had a piece just a few days ago where they wrote about his membership in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is why I thought it was so weird that the Washington Post said it was conservatives that were conducting a whisper campaign. because I looked at the New York Times piece and they said, Khashoggi's friends were even saying that whenever they would talk with him, he very much expressed anti-Western sentiments, and he was very much into political Islam, and he was very much more extreme than some of what was being promoted in the charm offensive by the Saudi Crown Prince. And you just touched on, Dr. Jasser, you just touched on one of the other points I was going to ask you was whether or not that charm offensive and all of this reform that we hear being discussed with the Saudi royal family and with Saudi leadership and policy, if it was real reform or if it was more just sort of a way to survive politically. And you answered that for me.
Yeah, I mean, MBS is no more a real reformer than Khashoggi is, according to the Washington Post, contrary to what the Washington Post said. 2 months ago, Khashoggi was writing about how the caliphate is real, the Muslim Brotherhood should be given time to evolve, and the bottom line, it's a majoritocratic approach to theocracy, if you will, and that's not liberal democracy. And I have to tell you, I did my podcast that'll air this weekend on Khashoggi. Reform This is the name of it, and I basically talk about how much disservice and how much it breaks my heart that they are lionizing a gentleman who, yes, we should speak out. Our allies should not be abusing or violating the human rights of people that are American residents or alone. And I said what the Saudis should do if they really want the recompense for what they did to this man, release Raif Badawi, release Walid Abu Khair, the attorney that has been in jail for defending Raif Badawi. We have called for the release of tons of prisoners of conscience in Saudi Arabia who are secularists, who are Christians, who are other minorities that have been abused, and nobody cared until somebody who was in the inner circles of the Islamist lobby in Washington got assassinated. And now all of a sudden they care about the Yemenis who are being massacred by the Saudis. Now all of a sudden the elite in Washington care about the human rights abuses of the Saudis, when for 8 years we couldn't get Obama to mention once the name of a dissident in Saudi Arabia that we've been working to help. So this is just, I mean, the reality is that we should change the way we approach and hold them accountable. We should not end arms deals, but actually start to hold them accountable. And the reason we shouldn't end the arms deal is that's a balance against the Iranians. There's nothing more backslapping that's happening now than between the ministers of foreign affairs in Syria, in Iran, and Turkey that are cheering on the decrease in the stability between the American and Saudi relationship.
Yes, and that would explain why all of a sudden, as you mentioned, how nobody really said anything about the president's silence, the previous president's silence, and all of these dissidents and individuals that you named who are wrongly imprisoned. They haven't really said anything about them, the previous administration's silence of it. But those are all the same people that attacked everyone else that wanted to end that fake deal with Iran. They seem to be apologists for Iran, and I see them seizing and exploiting the situation as a way to try to position Iran a little bit better. Do you see the same?
Absolutely, and that's the whole thing. If you look at the Ben Rhodes, friends, what are they doing? They're trying to find any way possible to resurrect an Obama legacy that wasn't about feeding a terrorist state, Iran, that was feeding a genocide in Syria and elsewhere, to sort of resurrect some type of semblance of rationality, which there wasn't any, to the Obama-Kerry approach. And now, if you see Secretary Pompeo trying to rebuild the relationship with the Saudis and tell them what's going to come, if they show a picture of him smiling, then all of a sudden that becomes a bizarre photo op, when in fact Kerry was smiling with dictators and tyrants in Iran and Tehran and Egypt and elsewhere, and nobody seemed to say anything about that. And it's just beyond a double standard. I have to tell you, it breaks my heart as an American to see our values trampled on in the name of sort of revisionist history, because all they're worried about is the Democratic Party's legacy under Obama rather than actually the real values. And here you have a Washington Post editorial board putting out an op-ed saying that we are trying to destroy a man's history. And I said on my podcast, if I was to disappear tomorrow, I would hope that my critics would continue to be critical of me, because it's dishonest to all of a sudden become lionizing of somebody and lie about them after they die, when in fact you're dishonoring their entire service. And this guy's writings was anti-Israel, anti-Western. He was not part of the secular, liberal, democratic movement of the Middle East. It's just a lie.
Yeah. Last question for you, Dr. Jasser, and we're talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser here, and we appreciate your time. So, I mean, obviously, we can't have allies or anyone with whom we are associated behaving like that. We don't want them to behave in a way where they're killing people in broad daylight and they really don't seem to worry about the repercussions of it. How should the administration handle this with Saudi Arabia so as to not destabilize that relationship and then give Iran a leg up and further empower them?
I think we do a little more than we did, for example, to the Russians when they used the chemical weapon and assassinated an individual in the UK. We basically tell them, number one, we put sanctions against some of their wealthiest individuals in Saudi Arabia so that we have them pay a price where it hurts, which is in the oil industry. Number two, we demand that they release prisoners that we know we've been asking for their release. Canada just had a conflagration with their foreign minister in the Saudis where they asked for Raif Badawi, Walid Abu Khair's release. Say that, you know what, if you guys really didn't mean to do this, then release these other prisoners so that you can at least show that you're heading towards some liberalization. And third, I think we hold them accountable with transparency into the future about not only human rights, but about saying, you know what, we're going to stop doing the operations in Yemen. There are some American planes being used there. I think we tell them that's enough. Stop doing, that we're not going to tolerate that anymore, and that would be the third part of it.
Right. There you go. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, always such a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate your expertise on this and for bringing some perspective and illuminating this issue. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Dana. Anytime.
Mm-hmm.